There are things you expect to carry after someone hurts you. The memory of what happened. The questions that never really got answered. That quiet replay of the moment, as if looking at it long enough might change something. That part makes sense. What doesn't make sense, at least not at first, is the weight that comes after. Not the weight of them, but the weight of what you slowly began to believe about yourself. Because if you look closely, the moment they hurt, you didn't just end when they walked away, or when the conversation stopped, or when the truth finally showed itself. Something stayed. And it didn't look like anger. It didn't even look like pain in the way people usually describe it. It looked like a shift. Subtle enough that you didn't question it at the time. Quiet enough that it felt almost reasonable. Maybe it sounded like, I should have seen it coming. I let this happen. I wasn't enough for them to stay, to choose me, to treat me better. And the strange part is, those thoughts didn't feel like harm. They felt like clarity, like you were finally understanding what went wrong. But that's where something inside you began to change. Because instead of placing the weight where it belonged, you started carrying it yourself. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just in small, almost invisible ways. You became a little more careful with how much of yourself you showed. A little quicker to question your own worth. A little more willing to take responsibility for things that were never fully yours. And over time, that version of you started to feel normal. So normal, in fact, that you stopped noticing the difference between what happened to you and what you've been doing to yourself ever since. Because the truth is, the people who hurt you don't stay in your life forever. They leave. Or you leave. Or time just creates distance. But what they started inside you, that's what lingers. That's what follows you into new conversations, new relationships, new opportunities. Not as a memory, but as a voice. And the hardest part is, you don't always recognize it as something that came from the outside. It starts to sound like you. It starts to feel like you. And before you realize it, you're no longer reacting to what they did. You're living inside what you decided it meant about you. And that's where the real weight begins. Not in the moment you were hurt, but in the quiet, unchallenged story that formed right after it. The one you never meant to carry this far. It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a clear line where you could say, this is where I became this version of myself. It was quieter than that. It was in the moment you paused just for a second longer than usual after something felt off. The way they said something that didn't sit right. The way they pulled away without explanation. The way you felt something shift, but chose to stay still. Not because you didn't notice, but because noticing would have meant admitting something you weren't ready to face yet. So instead you adjusted. You told yourself it wasn't a big deal. You replayed it in a way that made it easier to accept. You gave them the benefit of the doubt, even when it cost you your own clarity. And in that moment, small as it seemed, you moved slightly away from yourself. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough to question your instinct. Enough to soften your boundaries. Enough to make room for something that didn't fully respect you. And the thing is, most people wouldn't even call that a defining moment. They'd say the real moment was the betrayal, the argument, the ending. But the truth is, something had already started long before that. Because every time you chose to overlook what you felt, Every time you explained away something that didn't feel right, you were slowly learning to trust yourself less. And once that starts, it doesn't stay contained to that one situation. It follows you into how you interpret people, into how much you allow, into how quickly you turn inward when something goes wrong. So when things finally did fall apart, when the hurt became undeniable, it didn't just feel like they let you down. It felt like you let yourself down too. And that's the part that stays. Not just what they did, but the quiet realization that somewhere along the way, you stopped standing fully on your own side. And once that feeling settles in, it doesn't just disappear, it lingers. Not as a clear thought, but as something harder to name. Something that doesn't speak loudly, but is always there, just beneath the surface, waiting. It doesn't arrive like a voice at first. There's no clear beginning, no moment where you notice something new has entered your mind. It just continues. A thought here, a hesitation there, a second guessing that feels small enough to ignore. And if you're not paying attention, it blends in so well, you don't question it. You just assume it's you. It shows up in quiet ways. When something good begins to form, it leans in and asks, "Are you sure this is going to last?" When someone treats you well, it interrupts with, "What are they really seeing in you?" When you think about opening up again, it tightens something inside and whispers, "Don't forget what happened last time." It doesn't shout. It doesn't force. It suggests. And because it sounds calm, almost reasonable, you listen. That's what makes it difficult to recognize, because it doesn't feel like harm. It feels like protection, like something in you is just trying to be careful now, trying not to repeat the same mistake. But if you look closely, it's not protecting you from the future. It's replaying the past, over and over again. Not in the exact same form, but in meaning. It takes what happened once and quietly assumes it will happen again. It takes how you felt then and makes it something you should expect now. It takes who you were in that moment and convinces you that's who you are. And the more you hear it, the more familiar it becomes, until eventually you stop separating it from yourself. You don't say, "A part of me feels this way." You just say, "This is how I am," careful, guarded, doubtful, not realizing that what you're calling your personality might just be something that formed in response to being hurt, something that stayed long after it needed to. And the hardest part is, even when the person who hurt you is no longer in your life, this voice continues the conversation. It keeps asking the same questions, making the same assumptions, drawing the same conclusions, as if the moment never really ended. And after a while, you stop trying to argue with it. You just start living around it, adjusting your choices, holding parts of yourself back, accepting limits that were never truly yours, all because something inside you learned to repeat what hurt you in a way that feels like truth. But that voice didn't come from nowhere. It didn't just appear without reason. There's a part of you that allowed it to take shape, that gave it space, that in a strange way needed it to exist. Not because you wanted to suffer, but because at the time it made sense. It's easy to think this just happened to you. Like the voice appeared on its own. Like the doubt, the second guessing, the quiet distance from yourself was just a side effect of being hurt. But if you sit with it a little longer, there's something more uncomfortable underneath. Something quieter, but more honest. A part of you agreed to it. Not consciously, not in a way you would have chosen if you saw it clearly. But in that moment, when things didn't make sense, when the hurt felt too sudden or too deep, you needed something to hold on to, some kind of explanation. Because not knowing why something happened feels worse than blaming yourself for it. If it was random, if it was just them, if it had nothing to do with you, then it means you never really had control to begin with. And that's a hard thing to sit with. So instead, your mind reaches for something more solid. It must have been me. I should have done something differently. Next time, I'll be better. I won't let this happen again. And for a moment, that feels stabilizing. Because now there's a reason. Now there's something you can fix. Now there's a sense, however fragile, that you can prevent this kind of pain in the future. But what that really does is turn you against yourself. It takes the weight of what happened and places it entirely on your shoulders. Not because it belongs there, but because carrying it feels safer than admitting you couldn't control it. And over time, that way of thinking becomes automatic. You stop questioning whether something is truly your fault. You just assume there's something you missed, something you could have done better, something in you that needs adjusting. Even in situations that have nothing to do with the past, you respond as if they do, because that belief, that it was you, never really left. It just changed shape. And the difficult part is, this isn't coming from a place of weakness. It's coming from a place that was trying to protect you, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense, trying to create order out of something that felt chaotic, trying to make sure you never felt that same kind of hurt again. But in doing that, it taught you to question yourself more than you question what happened. And once that becomes your default, it doesn't stay contained to the past. It starts shaping how you move through everything. The choices you hesitate on, the things you don't say, the parts of yourself you keep at a distance. All of it traced back to that quiet decision to take responsibility for something that was never fully yours to carry. And you've been carrying it ever since. It doesn't always look like something is wrong. From the outside, your life can seem steady, even put together. You show up. You respond when people need you. You handle things the way you're supposed to. Nothing about it immediately signals that you're carrying something heavy. But it's there, in the way you move, in the pauses that didn't used to exist, in the things you think twice about before saying, in how quickly you adjust yourself depending on who you're around. It's subtle. You start measuring your words a little more carefully, not because you're dishonest, but because you're trying to avoid being misunderstood again. You hold parts of yourself back, not because you don't want to share, but because you've learned what it feels like when openness isn't received the way you expected. You become more aware of how you might come across, more attentive to shifts in tone, in energy, in reactions, always scanning, just a little. And over time, this way of being becomes so familiar that you don't question it. You call it growth. You call it maturity. You tell yourself you've just learned from your experiences, and in some ways that's true. But there's another side to it that's harder to see. Because mixed in with that awareness is hesitation. Mixed in with that care is restraint. Mixed in with that understanding is a quiet fear of getting it wrong again. So instead of moving freely, you move carefully. Instead of expressing fully, you filter. Instead of trusting what you feel in the moment, you check it, then check it again. Not because you don't know yourself, but because somewhere along the way you stopped fully believing that your first instinct could be trusted. And this doesn't just affect how you interact with others. It changes how you experience your own life. Moments that could have been simple become something you analyze. Decisions that could have been natural become something you overthink. Connections that could have unfolded easily become something you approach with quiet distance. Not enough to push people away completely, but enough to keep a part of you just out of reach. And the strange thing is, you can go a long time like this without realizing what's happening. Because nothing feels obviously broken. It just feels slightly limited, like you're present but not fully there, like you're participating but holding something back at the same time. And that something isn't random. It's the version of you that learned to be careful with itself. The version that formed when you decided, without fully realizing it, that it was safer not to stand too firmly on your own side. And as long as that stays in place, everything you build on top of it will carry that same quiet tension. Not loud enough to stop your life, but enough to keep you from fully stepping into it. Which raises a question you don't always ask directly. How much of your life right now is shaped by something that was never meant to last this long? At some point, you've probably told yourself that you need to forgive them. Maybe you've even tried. You've gone over what happened, looked at it from different angles, tried to understand why they did what they did. You've told yourself they were dealing with their own issues, that people act from their own pain, that holding on to resentment only keeps you stuck. And on the surface, that makes sense, because letting go of anger does create space. But if you're honest, even after all of that, something still feels unresolved. Not as intense as before, not as sharp, but still there. And that's the part most people don't talk about. Because forgiving them doesn't automatically change how you see yourself. It doesn't undo the quiet conclusions you came to in that moment. It doesn't erase the way you started questioning your worth, or second-guessing your instincts, or holding parts of yourself back. It only addresses what happened between you and them, not what's been happening within you ever since. So you can reach a place where you no longer feel anger toward them, and still feel disconnected from yourself. You can understand them, and still not trust your own judgment. You can let them go, and still carry the version of you that was shaped in that experience. And that's where the real work begins. Not in rewriting their actions, not in finding better explanations for why it happened, but in looking at what you took from it and questioning whether it was ever true to begin with. Because forgiveness, in the way it's often understood, is outward. It's about releasing someone else from what they did. But the weight you've been carrying isn't coming from them anymore. It's coming from the way you've been holding yourself since, from the standards you quietly raised against yourself, from the blame you never fully let go of, from the part of you that still believes you should have been different, better, more aware, less trusting. And until that is addressed, forgiveness will always feel incomplete. Not because you're doing it wrong, but because you've been aiming it in the wrong direction. It doesn't happen all at once. You don't wake up one morning and suddenly feel free. It's quieter than that. It's in the small choices, the moments when you catch yourself listening to that old voice, and instead of agreeing, you simply notice it. The times when you acknowledge what you've been carrying without apologizing for it, without trying to fix it, without feeling like you need to shrink to make it smaller. It's in allowing yourself to make mistakes and meet them with understanding instead of judgment, in giving yourself the same patience you've given others, in seeing the parts of yourself you've hidden as not flawed, but human. Putting down the weight isn't a dramatic gesture. It's not a speech you make to anyone else. It's a quiet, daily practice of deciding, every time you feel that familiar self-blame, that it doesn't get to define you anymore. Because the people who hurt you are gone. And the moment that shaped the first version of that voice is over. What remains now is yours to claim. The space that used to be filled with doubt can now be filled with presence. The energy that went into guarding yourself can now go into living. The care you used to reserve for others' mistakes can now be returned to you. And the most important part, you don't have to forgive them first. You don't have to wait for apologies. You don't have to understand why it happened. You don't have to shrink yourself to make peace. All you need to do is look at yourself with a little more honesty, a little more patience, a little more allowance for the person you are today. And in that quiet, steady way, the weight finally begins to lift. Not because the past has changed, but because you've finally stopped letting it live inside you. You finally step back into your own life. And in doing so, you've reclaimed a part of yourself that's been waiting all along,